In heavy wind and blinding rain, the crew of a passenger jet struggles to land.
Put it down! Put it down!
A terrifying crash landing leads to a desperate fight to survive.
The only thing that matters to me now is to get my daughter Emily and protect her as we blow up.
But we just knew that there were so many passengers in that plane that had not gotten out.
Open the door! Open the door! Mayday, Mayday.
This is a true story based on air traffic control recordings, official reports, and interviews with those involved. Tuesday, August the 2nd, 2005. Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. 297 passengers are boarding Air France Flight 358, bound for Toronto.
Far aisle, left-hand side. Merci.
Philippe Lacaille is traveling with his wife and 2 of his 4 children.
Would you like the windows?
They're stuck at the back of the enormous jet, and they're not sitting together.
It just happened that we were separated from Emily. They had 3 seats together, so we were in the middle section, and Emily was actually sitting a couple of seats ahead of us on the right side, so close to the right wing of the plane.
For Eddie Ho, Flight 358 is the continuation of a trip that began in Johannesburg.
I'm an international student in Canada at Queen's University, and every summer I go back to South Africa.
Ho isn't traveling light.
I was carrying everything that I had, my books to my clothing to tuition money for the year, computer laptops.
This is also another leg in a long journey for Joanne Cordery Bundock, who's returning from a trip to Thailand.
I rerouted myself in the last 2 days before the flight from Bangkok through Paris to come directly to Toronto.
As the passengers continue to board, the flight crew gets settled into the Airbus A340. The captain is 57-year-old Alain Rosaille. He's been with Air France for more than 20 years. His co-pilot is 43-year-old Frédéric No.
Do you want to start, or should I?
Why don't you fly first, and then I'll take over for landing in Toronto. I'll check the weather.
On this flight, the 2 men decide that Captain Rosaille will handle the takeoff in Paris, and co-pilot No will land in Toronto.
Destination, Toronto Pearson.
Check. Crews often split the duties so that co-pilots can get more experience. Rosaille and No are joined by one other person in the cockpit.
I think you've been expecting me. I'm Miles Trochassé.
Welcome.
Miles Trochassé is the son of an Air France employee. He's allowed to ride in the cockpit's jump seat for free.
I just want to let you know I've done this before. I promise I'll be quiet.
This Air France plane is one of the safest in the world. Since the A340s first went into service in 1993, they've had an excellent safety record.
Air France 358. Air France 358, runway 27 left. Cleared for takeoff.
Cleared for takeoff. Air France 358. Have a good afternoon, gentlemen.
Just a few minutes before 2 in the afternoon, Flight 358 powers into the sky above Paris. Toronto may be several thousand kilometers away, but the friends and family of those on board Flight 358 are already making plans to meet the plane when it arrives.
Hello? Audrey, I won't forget. I'll make sure to pick up Mom and Dad. No, I won't forget the 2 brats either. I'll get them all.
Well, we usually make arrangements before we go to France to be picked up. It's easier because we have lots of luggage, and we bring back stuff from France. So it just happened that Julian, our son, was going to spend the summer in Toronto and was available to pick us up.
Sis, I'll give you a call as soon as I get in. Don't worry. I got it covered. Okay? All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Center, we have a humidex advisory and extreme heat alert for Toronto, as well as a thunderstorm warning in effect for Toronto.
A regular flight from Paris to Toronto takes about 8 hours. As Air France 358 closes in on Canada, there's little to separate this trip from any other.
I found that their service was amazing. The food was great. They had very good flight attendants.
There were a lot of exchange students from France, like teenagers, coming to Canada for their first time, usually their first flight, and they were very rowdy.
There was a beautiful day on the flight over, and the sun was shining, and it was just blue skies and white clouds, and just a lovely day.
The autopilot does most of the work for Captain Alain Rezai and his co-pilot Frédéric No. Just as the two men had planned, No is now in control of the plane.
We have a new weather report.
The two men get regular updates on the weather conditions in Toronto.
Overcast and rainy with a chance of thunderstorms. Temperature in the low 20s.
At Toronto's International Airport, the thunderstorms are already rolling through. Rain, wind, and lightning are hammering the runways. The lightning has already forced airport authorities to declare a red alert. It means that the chance of being struck by lightning is so great that ground crews are not allowed to work on the planes. Just as Flight 358 closes in on Toronto, it's put into a holding pattern. The weather isn't getting any better.
358, there's going to be a little delay. Air France 358, so roger on delay. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I'm sorry to inform you that there'll be a short delay. There's some weather conditions above Toronto, and we're just going to give it a couple of minutes to clear up.
I was very surprised when I heard the captain's announcement that we were going to be delayed in landing for about 25 or 30 minutes because of thunderstorms over Toronto.
While they're not in the storm yet, the crew enters their holding pattern northeast of Toronto. Their alternate airport is almost 300 kilometers away in Ottawa. At the moment, the plane has a little over 7,500 kilograms of fuel in its tanks, more than enough to get them there.
Typically, a pilot will think about the economic impact of diverting to an alternate airport. While that is not a primary decision maker, it is an alternate decision maker as far as if they have to divert, how are the folks going to be transported from that alternate airport back to the destination airport that the airplane was originally going to.
Flying almost 300 passengers to Ottawa would be a logistical nightmare. But the crew can't circle for too long with the fuel they have. If the delay continues, they'll have no choice but to divert.
Air France, Toronto arrival. Your hold is now canceled. You are cleared for a WASI 2 arrival. Maintain 5,000 feet. Air France 358, roger on cancellation of hold. Cleared for WASI 2 arrival and maintain...
Today, the delay isn't long at all. Although the storm continues to thunder down near the airport, the crew is put into their landing sequence.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Just wanted to let you know we're beginning our descent into Toronto at this time. We should be on the ground at about 4 p.m. local time.
Usually when they say 45 minutes, it's to be nice. Usually it's like an hour and a half. This time it was like 20 minutes. 20 minutes later, they said, okay, well, now we're gonna go down, prepare, for the landing.
With co-pilot Frédéric No at the controls, the plane begins its descent into the storm.
Air France 358, reducing speed to 190.
No isn't prepared for what he's about to face. The storm has a savage surprise in store for everyone on board Flight 358. A brutal summer storm is battering Toronto. Winds and lightning are hammering the airport, making it tense for incoming planes. After a short hold, Air France Flight 358, with 297 passengers aboard, begins descending into the storm.
Flaps 2.
Flaps 2. F-speed.
Gear down.
Landing gear down. Spoilers armed. 4 green.
Landing gear down. Spoilers armed. 4 green.
You'll be fine. Don't worry. It immediately turned into very dark skies and dark clouds and a little bit bumpy and choppy, and the weather outside was definitely within a thunderstorm. But really and truly, to me, it was just a typical stormy landing. Nothing out of the ordinary.
In the main cabin, though, not everyone is so sure.
The plane was getting very bumpy. There was a lot of turbulence. We were surrounded basically by heavy weather, and this was completely not expected. I didn't expect that.
Air France 358, slow your final approach speed.
Air France 358.
Co-pilot Frédéric No has the plane in position. He's moments from landing.
Air France 358, roger.
Flaps to full.
Flaps full.
It was going darker and darker. We were like in the middle of hundreds and hundreds of lightnings. Like every second we had lightnings all around us. So people were getting nervous, quite nervous. I was getting nervous.
Ahead of the Air France Airbus, 2 other planes have just touched down on the same runway that Flight 358 is heading for.
Air France 358, this is Toronto Tower.
Toronto Tower, Air France 358, go ahead.
You are cleared to land runway 24 left. Be advised, the preceding aircraft reports braking action is poor, and they estimate the surface winds near the runway as 290 degrees at 15 to 20 knots.
Braking poor, 15 knots, gust to 20. Air France 358, thank you.
The crew is being sent to runway 24 left, which will allow them to land into the wind. It also happens to be the closest runway to the city's biggest freeway, which is gearing up to handle the evening rush hour traffic. Facing unpredictable winds and a wet runway, the crew prepare for the landing.
Select auto brakes to medium.
Medium is set.
The final approach for landing was hellish. Lightnings were all over. Turbulences were enormous. You could feel the pilot fight with the plane to keep the plane in line with the runway to land, and they had a heck of a time to keep it lined up. I know my son next to me was getting very nervous, and I was nervous to see my daughter actually far from us.
I cinched up my seatbelt tighter than it was, expecting a very hard landing, and the pilot was going to stick it on the runway, or we were maybe going to do a touch and go, and he was going to give it power and go around, because I knew that it was not going to be just a normal landing.
Landing, autopilot, auto thrust off.
At 2 minutes after 4 o'clock, Air France Flight 358 roars over the beginning of the runway.
Put it down. Put it down.
This landing was more intense and harder than any time I've ever landed in another aircraft.
It's a very difficult landing. And everyone started clapping, and even the lady who sitting next to me, I remember very clearly, she said, you know, wow, that was an amazing landing. And as soon as she finished that sentence, then all hell broke loose.
We started the plane started violently going up and down, and it felt like we were going 100 miles an hour down a road filled with potholes that were about 3 feet deep.
Immediately you could see this orange aura, and for me it's a picture I will never forget. My daughter was sitting ahead of us on the right side of the plane, and at that time she turned her head towards us, you know, with very wide eyes, you know, looking at us, and her face was surrounded by this enormous aura, orange aura of fire.
Then, moments after touching down, still traveling at 146 kilometers per hour, Flight 358 runs out of room.
At that point that I believed that we were all going to die. It was obvious that no one can survive this kind of thing.
I thought this was it.
The next thing that I can remember is that an announcement came. Ladies and gentlemen, everything's okay. We've stopped now. Well, no kidding. Of course we've stopped now. But I could tell that everything was not okay because I could immediately smell jet fuel.
As the smell of jet fuel fills the cabin, panic quickly spreads.
Everybody was expecting the plane to blow up. It was obvious.
Smoke and flames are spreading quickly. Now it's a desperate struggle to escape.
You hear shouting from the back that there was a fire, and then people started really getting panicked.
If they don't get out, they have just seconds to live.
We know that about 2 minutes into a fire, in many cases, the environment becomes untenable. So 90 seconds is a good rule that we use in trying to get people out to make sure that they have as much time and safety as possible.
297 passengers are desperate to leave the plane.
Emily!
The only thing that matters to me now is to get my daughter Emily, who's sitting like 2 seats ahead of me, get her onto me, and protect her as we blow up.
Am I going to try to get my luggage, my laptop? And then I thought to myself, what if I would die trying to get my laptop? I just said, okay, I've got to get out. I've got to get out.
Flight 358 has 8 possible emergency exits, but seconds after the crash, most of them aren't opened.
people were crawling over the seats, they were pushing each other, they were just basically all for yourself.
It's okay. Stay calm, please. Please stay calm. Be all right.
Open the door! Open the door!
And I could see the air attendant there struggling with the fact that should I or should I not open this door, because the fire was raging just in front of it.
If the fuel tanks rupture and we have a lot of fuel that gets out either onto the ground, well then there's enough heat and fire there that would cause the airplane skin to melt in a couple minutes.
At the front of the plane, thick smoke is pouring in through one of the open doors. Joanne Cordery-Bundock races to the other side of the plane.
The gentleman in front of me had his bag with him, and he was kind of fumbling around with that and trying to take that down the slide. He was a rather large man, and the slide did not deploy the entire way, so I kind of bailed off the side above him and hit the ground.
Eddie Ho has found an exit too, but there's no slide.
And people pushing me forward, I couldn't even control myself. And I was like, you know, I don't want to jump as well because, you know, it was 5 meters down at least.
Is he okay? Is he okay?
In the cockpit, Captain Rosai has been badly injured when his seat was ripped off the floor by the force of the crash. As precious seconds tick by, the flight attendant near the lacailles manages to open the exit door. Even though passengers are confronted with the flames and smoke of the burning engine, they jump out of the plane.
So push them down, my wife went down, I went down. We just ran up as fast as we could through torn metal and thorns and like through whatever was left of the ground where the plane was.
Once the fire gets inside the airplane, all of the furnishings are much like the furnishings in your house, and there are foams and materials that, when they catch on fire, produce toxic gases, and that's really the most important lethal aspect of the fire.
Basically, you just had to jump. So what I did was, you know, I prayed quickly and I closed my eyes and jumped.
Emergency workers are able to reach the burning jet just 52 seconds after it crashes. But with the threat of an explosion, it's dangerous to get too close.
It was very difficult to see anything due to the rain that was coming down. There was a lot of smoke engulfing the plane, some fire that was still ongoing, as well as you could see that some of the parts of the plane had broken off, some of the wheels that were at the side of the roadway, as well as portions of the plane's wings that had broken off.
Philippe Lacaille and his family struggle up the hill the plane has just plowed down.
You know, and at that point, the plane blew up. Once, twice, 3 times. So you could feel and hear this enormous explosion actually taking place. On the first one, I looked at the first one because I just couldn't believe my eyes. You know, I could see, I think, pieces of luggage, things flying up in the air. You know. And of course, at that time, I figured, oh my God, you know, that could have been us. You know.
We had a perfect view of the airplane and see this black smoke coming out the side of the airplane, and the yellow and the orange and the red flames shooting out. We were fine, but we just knew that there were so many passengers in that plane that had not gotten out.
August the 2nd, 2005. Air France Flight 358 has crashed off its runway in Toronto. Flames are tearing at the fuselage. Smoke is pouring from the ruined jet. Dazed passengers are stumbling from the plane.
Passengers that were coming up, again, were very rain-soaked and muddy from coming up the hill. There were several individuals that once they got up there were crying and a bit emotional, as well as looking around for other passengers or family or friends that may have been with them at the time.
About 35 minutes ago, a plane ran off the runway at Toronto's Pearson Airport.
Footage of the crash quickly appears on local TV stations. Philippe Lacaille's daughter Audrey is one of the many people shocked by the pictures.
She turned on her TV, and here we go. There was the Air France crash right here, live in front of her, you know, burning, exploding right in front of her eyes.
250 people on board. We have not had any reason to make a statement yet as to whether anybody has survived or escaped.
Philippe Lacaille's son Julien is waiting for his father at the airport. He has no idea what's just happened to the Air France flight.
What? What do you mean, where am I? I'm at the airport waiting for mom and dad. Like, you... What?
So Julian didn't know anything, and he was there at the airport. And she says, well, you know what? I think you're going to have to wait a long time because the airplane just crashed.
One of the busiest highways in North America borders the airport. Just before rush hour, it's packed with thousands of vehicles. Drivers slow down, captivated by the terrifying sight of the burning plane. Some of the passengers who've escaped the plane stumble, dazed and shaken, right onto the edge of the highway. Passing motorists stop to take them to the airport.
At this point, there was only about 25 or 30 people with me in the airport. And here, you're also beginning to think, is this all there is?
As people are brought in, airport employees struggle to account for all the passengers and crew.
They were totally disorganized. There's no announcements being made. There's nothing of any kind of organization, and you're in this little crowded area with all the irate passengers waiting to be processed. Some people even said, you know, the first disaster was the plane crash, and the second disaster is exactly how it was handled afterwards.
Relatives wait desperately for any news. Julien Lacaille is just one of many who fears the worst.
For at least an hour and a half, he thought we were dead. That's a shame because, of course, we panicked. We were scared to death. But the families that were waiting for the passengers, they were even more scared because it lasted much longer. They really believed deep down that their family members were dead.
Finally, hours after the crash, passengers who have waiting family members are reunited.
Julian! Julian!
What's up? Oh, you okay? Oh my God!
We're okay. How did you...
We finally met up with Julian. It was 11 o'clock at night. It was, you know, God, we're so lucky. We're so lucky. We're alive, you know? It's hard to explain, but it's like you're giving a second chance, you know? Here's my son, you know. Maybe I didn't tell him I loved him, you know, when I left for France. Now it's time to say it right away. It was a very nice moment. A very, very deep moment.
It's just one of dozens of reunions. It takes hours to confirm, but by early evening, Air France and the local airport authorities can make the incredible announcement. Remarkably, every single passenger and all the members of the crew of Flight 358 have managed to escape the burning wreckage of their plane. The next day, smoke and charred wreckage are all that remain of Air France Flight 358. The Airbus A340 is a sophisticated, highly engineered plane with a glowing safety record. What had gone so terribly wrong? Canada's Transportation Safety Board quickly begins investigating the accident.
Landing, autopilot, auto thrust off.
Rain and lightning had been battling the airport all afternoon. Was it simply bad weather that caused this crash?
Put it down! Put it down!
Neither the pilot nor the co-pilot have spoken publicly about the crash.
We have to evacuate now!
Citing lawsuits that were filed soon after, Air France has kept all of its employees who were on the plane from speaking to the media.
Is he okay? I don't know. Is he okay? I don't know.
But former Air France trainer Hervé Labarthe has spoken to Captain Rosaille.
We spoke, let me think, for half an hour. He told me that this is the crucial point, that he has control. More specifically, informed control that he had reached the point where he would have to consider diverting. What he told me is that control informed him that they would soon open the runway. There was, of course, a lot of lightning, rain, and turbulence can have a devastating effect. Instruments become more difficult to read, the aircraft is harder to handle.
Investigators discover that as the crew struggled for control in the cockpit, on the ground, delicate instruments used to measure the wind at the runway were destroyed by lightning. With the ground equipment destroyed, they were relying on their onboard systems for information about wind conditions.
The onboard equipment only gives them the actual wind direction and speed on the nose of the aircraft at that exact time. It does not predict ahead of the aircraft. So the pilots really have no way of knowing what lies ahead of them.
But two planes had touched down just minutes before the Air France flight on the same runway. The crews of those planes did their best to inform air traffic control of the tricky conditions.
Air France 358, this is Toronto Tower.
Toronto Tower, Air France 358, go ahead.
You are cleared to land runway 24 left. Be advised, preceding aircraft reports braking action is poor, and they estimate the surface winds near the runway as 290 degrees at 15 to 20 knots.
Braking poor, 15 knots.
20-knot winds are strong, but are well within the allowable range for landing an A340. But when investigators study radar images of the airport, they discover quite a different story. As Flight 358 landed, a sharp line of rain moved across the runway from north to south. It was driven by a sudden gust of wind of up to 33 knots. The crew of the Air France jet had to deal with conditions that were much worse than they were expecting.
Landing, autopilot, auto thrust off.
33 knots is the demonstrated maximum crosswind for an A340, and that would be on a dry runway. So when you say 33 knots at 90 degrees, you're encroaching on the limits of the aircraft.
Closely studying the airport, investigators uncover another piece of the puzzle. Maintenance issues and the storm itself were forcing air traffic controllers to use runway 24 left for landings. It's the shortest runway at the airport, almost 650 meters shorter than some of the others. Blinded by rain, driven by unexpected winds, and landing on the shortest runway at the airport, Flight 358 was in a dangerous position.
Over the previous 4 hours, they had been made aware of the terrible storms and red alerts. And that was for me my biggest concern. Were they perhaps overtired? Were they lax, victims of routine? In any case, it's obvious that they hadn't gauged the extent of the danger.
It's evident that the flight crew didn't perceive the information that they were getting from these various sources as being threatening. Therefore, they attempted to make a landing.
But even in bad conditions, even on a short runway, the crew had 3,000 meters in which to land their plane. It should have been enough. To find out why it wasn't, investigators turned to the past. In 1999, an eerily similar accident took place in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Damn, we're off course. Oh, I can't see it. Way off.
Struggling with unpredictable weather, the crew of an American Airlines jet landed their plane, only to have it skid off the runway. 11 people were killed. Greg Feith helped investigate that crash.
One of the first things that I thought about was déjà vu. Having the first bits of information about the Air France accident, it reminded me so much of the American Airlines accident.
In the Little Rock crash, Feith discovered that the crew had made a critical mistake, which contributed significantly to the accident.
They hadn't followed all of the checklist procedures, and they didn't have the ground spoilers armed, which basically degrades the efficiency of lift on the wing and settles the airplane heavily on the main wheels so that braking action is more effective.
Spoilers are only one of several ways pilots of passenger jets stop their massive planes. Reverse thrusters are used to redirect the engine power forward as the plane lands, and sophisticated brakes help slow the jets down. To rule out any mechanical fault, all three systems are examined by investigators of the Air France crash. One of the brakes on Flight 358 was destroyed in the fire, but the 7 other sets of brakes are all tested after the accident. All of them are working properly.
Flaps 2. Flaps 2. F-speed. Gear down.
Investigators in Toronto also discover that, unlike in the Little Rock crash, this time the spoilers had deployed properly.
Landing gear down, spoilers armed, 4 green.
And when the engines are examined, the reverse thrusters are deployed. No obvious mechanical fault can be found. As the investigation continues, a French newspaper prints a bombshell. Le Figaro publishes a story claiming that the thrust reversers, which use the jet's engines to slow it down, were not turned on until the plane had been on the runway for more than 12 seconds.
As
for Captain Rosay, he confirmed the newspaper report. His explanation was that his co-pilot had tense-stopped and was having difficulty controlling the lateral movement of the plane. No doubt because of the strong crosswinds and because the runway was so slippery, his hand was clamped tightly on the throttle release lever, which prevented the captain from reaching it himself. So the reverse thrusters could not be activated.
Shortly after the newspaper story appears, investigators publish their initial report. It confirms Le Figaro's version of events. Canada's Transportation Safety Board reveals that while the thrusters were found in the on position at the crash site, they had not been deployed as soon as the plane landed. In fact, it took 17 seconds before they reached maximum power.
The delay was a question raised in the report, and I wouldn't want to hazard a guess as to why there was such a delay or what was the cause of it. I just know that pilots, as a rule, want to get those reversers in as quickly as possible for maximum stopping.
The investigators reveal other confusing facts about the last few seconds of Flight 358. When it came over the start of the runway, it was twice as high as it should have been. And when it did land, it was nearly halfway down the runway.
Put it down! Put it down!
In these stormy conditions, the crew didn't have enough time to stop.
Once they found that the airplane had floated down the runway, the pilot has to make the decision whether we stay on the ground and try to salvage this bad situation, or we abort the landing, power up, pull up, and go around, get our stuff together, and then come back for a second landing.
Air France 358.
But decisions in a cockpit are joint decisions. The captain and the first officer work together.
If the captain sees that landing will be difficult, he must open throttle and go through abort landing procedures. That's his duty. And of course, the co-pilot is also allowed to be the first to act. But the captain's duty is to avoid at all costs a lengthy touchdown. That is clear.
Pour ne pas laisser se dérouler un atterrissage trop long, ça c'est clair.
By the time the plane touched down, it had only 1,500 meters to stop. And when it did land, critical seconds were lost when the reverse thrusters weren't engaged.
Would it have made a difference to immediately activate the reverse thrusters? Of course it would. Since reverse function reaches its peak efficiency at high speed, that is the exact moment of touchdown, that's what reverse is there for. It's all a matter of aerodynamic braking. The other problem is that the wheels touched ground in the middle of the runway, and reverse or no reverse, at that point it was already too late, as was pointed out by the head of the inquiry. That being said, if the reverse thrusters had been activated immediately, the plane would have come to a stop more quickly.
Il serait sorti moins et moins vite.
In heavy storms, the margin for error is razor thin. On this rain-filled afternoon, sudden wind, a long landing, and a short runway sealed the fate of everyone on board Flight 358. What concerns some in the aviation industry isn't this particular flight, but the reality that overruns are far too common. They happen all around the world, and safety procedures that could stop them are not in place. In August 2005, Air France Flight 358 crashed off the end of a runway in Toronto. It was a horrifying incident, yet amazingly everyone survived. But Flight 358 wasn't the only jet to go off the end of a runway in 2005. Worldwide, there were 37 other runway overruns. And the causes of all these accidents were remarkably similar.
There are a number of causal factors that occur again and again in runway overrun accidents. The weather conditions, the state of the runway surface. It can be wet, it can be icy, it can have snow on it. Speed in excess of a normal approach speed for the aircraft that does not then bleed off as the aircraft attempts to land. And these factors occur again and again in runway overrun accidents.
Unlike the crash at Toronto, some overruns are deadly. This Southwest Airlines flight in Chicago slid off its runway several months after the Air France crash. A small child was killed in a car that was driving on the nearby highway.
Many older airports, in particular in big cities which have expanded out towards the airport in the course of their growth, are constrained in the area that they can use for overruns.
You have to consider what happens when the runway is contaminated. Snow, ice, standing water. That will degrade the stopping performance of the airplane. Add to that a tailwind component, which was existent at the time that Air France landed. That, in combination with the contaminated runway, can jeopardize the landing performance and in fact increase it probably by 50%.
The International Civil Aviation Organization recommends that every airport have a 300-meter safety zone at the end of runways that handle international flights. Canadian standards are a little less strict. They call for a 60-meter overrun area and recommend another 90 meters on top of that. Runway 24 left meets the low end of those recommendations.
There was another runway overrun accident to the runway in Toronto, which was very closely aligned with the runway that is there at the moment, in 1978, when a DC-9, an Air Canada DC-9, rejected a takeoff and ran into the ravine.
Well, the plane started to brake, and then there was just nothing, and then we dropped over the edge. There was about a 50-foot drop, I guess, at the end of the runway. We just went over the top, and then there was a heck of a bang, and people and seats all over the place.
2 people died in the 1978 accident. A coroner's inquest after the crash recommended that the gully be filled in, but it never was.
It's a steep ravine. It has about a 50-foot drop-off, and when you take a large, complicated and fragile piece of machinery like a commercial aircraft and you drop it 50 feet, then it tends to break.
There is a possible solution to runway overruns, but it's not being used in Toronto or many other international airports. It's called EMAS, or Engineered Material Arresting Systems.
It's a form of artificial stone or artificial gravel, which has a certain depth. And anybody who's ridden a bicycle into a gravel pit knows that a bicycle stops very quickly and it can be almost impossible to pedal it out. And the same thing happens to airplanes.
Several airports in the US use the system, but most international airports do not.
It's very much more effective than friction braking, and it's certainly incomparably more effective than thrust reverse and spoilers. And any one of these systems, when properly engineered, can stop a large airplane, no matter what the runway surface conditions, in a very short distance.
We have to evacuate now!
But one vital air safety guideline was met when Flight 358 crashed. In spite of the smoke and the spreading fire, the crew of the crippled plane made sure that all the passengers escaped in just 90 seconds.
It's just a miracle that all of those people were able to evacuate the airplane as quickly as they did before the airplane was consumed.
The Air France flight was particularly noteworthy in that everybody got out, essentially unscathed. I know there were some injuries, but everyone got out. So I think it was noteworthy, and it was very good evacuation from that perspective.
Captain Alain Rosaille may never fly for Air France again. His injuries required extensive physical therapy after the crash. At the time, he was less than 3 years from retirement.
Every morning, Captain Rosaille relives the experience, coming face to face with the flames, the noise, the crash. And it made him sad to end his career on that note, having destroyed his plane. That's the worst possible fate for a pilot, the worst outcome.
The co-pilot, Frédéric No, is suspended for 3 months after the accident. By early the next year, he's back on duty with Air France. There are reports that after he helped Captain Rosaille out of the cockpit, he was the last person off the plane. The passengers deal with the crash in their own ways.
Well, I went through nightmares almost every single night, flashbacks during the day. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat. I questioned myself, why am I here? It's frightening, to be in such a state. And it has taught me to be strong.
We really need to take seriously those safety commands and evacuation information, because you never know. It was a perfect flight. There's not any indications that anything can go wrong, and it's right at the very last second that everything happens. So thank goodness I'm here to be able to talk about it now.
Open the door! Open the door!
There's a lot of negative in the accident, and there's a lot of positive. The negative is, oh my God, I'm gonna die. Oh my God, it's horrible. Oh, I have these nightmares, and yes, I'm traumatized, and my kids are traumatized. However, you have the positives, and the positives are, gee, I'm alive. I have been given a second chance. I have been given a second life. And all of us, my wife and my children and myself, we all experience the same positive effects of the crash, which is we have to give back. We have to do something for others. We have to extend our heart out, our compassion to people who need it. It's almost therapeutic for us, The more you do for others, the better you're gonna feel. So for me, I figured, if I can extend my heart out to others, maybe it's gonna help me as well.
High above the Indian Ocean, disaster strikes.
The engine's on fire!
More than 10 kilometers in the air, all 4 engines of a British Airways 747 stop working.
Roger, declare emergency.
Mayday, 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 Speedbird 9.
With no engines and little power, British Airways Flight 9 falls towards the ocean.
Standby ignition on.
The crew fight to keep their plane from crashing into the sea. What has crippled their massive jet, threatening the lives of everyone on board?
Mayday, Mayday.
June the 24th, 1982. British Airways Flight 9 cruises through the sky over Indonesia. In a few hours, the plane and all 263 people on board are scheduled to land in Perth, Australia. Phyllis Welch and her daughter are seated in cabin E at the very back of the enormous jet.
How's that heroine of yours, Fanny Price, faring?
Oh, she's having a tough old time at Mansfield Park. It's a good place for me to spend a few hours.
Wouldn't mind being there myself.
It's all right, Mum, we'll get there.
We had already traversed at least 2 time zones. We were very tired. We had flown through Bombay, through Kuala Lumpur, hadn't been able to get much sleep, if any, and it was a dark, dark, pitch-black night.
Ahead of Betty and Phyllis, Charles Capewell is returning home to Perth, Australia, with his 2 boys, Chaz and Stephen.
Right, settle down, lads. Come on. It's time for a nap. Get back to your seat.
No.
What, do you want to sleep here? All right.
It was a good flight. It was going well. Leaving London, it was great. And we was all eager to go home, and the 2 boys were eager to get back to Mum. I thought, well, we'll be home in 3 hours, Perth. They'll be pat and we'll get in a taxi and we'll be home.
While many of the passengers have been traveling for almost a day, the crew is fresh. They took control at the last stopover in Kuala Lumpur. Captain Eric Moody got his first taste of flying at the age of 16 when he took a gliding lesson. He was one of the first ever trained on the 747.
Roger, check with Jakarta.
Jakarta Control, Speedbird 9 over Halim at level 370.
Speedbird 9, Roger.
First Officer Roger Greaves has been a co-pilot for more than 6 years. Barry Townley Freeman has been a flight engineer on these aircraft for just a little longer.
I'd not flown with Eric before, or Barry. That was the first time we'd actually met on that flight.
As the jet flies over the city of Jakarta, it's cruising at more than 11,000 meters and has been in the air for an hour and a half. Captain Moody checks his weather radar. It shows smooth sailing for the next 500 kilometers.
All right, Roger, it's all clear. Just keep your eyes open. I'll be back in a moment. Just got to use the loo.
Back in the cabin, many of the passengers have fallen asleep. While Charles Capewell and his sons doze, an ominous haze appears above their heads. It's still legal to smoke on passenger jets in 1982. For the cabin crew, though, the smoke seems thicker than normal.
Seems to be a lot of smoke out there.
They begin to worry that a small fire may be smoldering somewhere on the plane.
Maybe someone lit up in the toilet. Let's go see if we can find it.
A fire at 11,000 meters is a terrifying prospect. If there is a blaze somewhere, the crew must find it immediately. In the cockpit, the flight takes an unsettling turn.
Barry and I were just sitting there minding the shop. Pitch dark night, of course. And then we started to get these pinpricks of light on the windscreen.
St. Elmo's fire? I don't think so.
St. Elmo's fire is a natural phenomenon that's sometimes seen when planes fly through highly charged thunderclouds. But there aren't supposed to be any thunderclouds tonight.
Anything on the radar? No. No, it's clear. I don't like the look of this. Let's get a better look out there.
With the help of their landing lights, the two men are disturbed to see a thin layer of cloud surrounding their plane, even though nothing is showing up on their radar.
But at 37,000 feet, the normal thing you would anticipate would be high cirrus, which is just a thin layer of cloud.
I think we better get the captain back up here.
I was reading in my book, and there was a slight flick of turbulence, just a slight flick, and I glanced over to the left, where I had a clear view of the port wing, and to my surprise, it was covered in a brilliant white, shimmering light, which seemed to be clinging to the wing of the aircraft. I carried on reading, but I found that I kept reading the same paragraph over and over again and not taking in a word of it. I just didn't know what was happening.
In the cabin, the smoke begins to thicken. Stewards have been unable to figure out where it's coming from. If there's a fire, they can't find it.
All right, well, go see that the passengers are comfortable.
Smell anything odd, Mum? Seems rather smoky in here.
I noticed that thick smoke was pouring into the cabin through the vents above the windows. And that was a very sobering sight.
Turkish cigarettes.
It smelt like sort of a sulfuric electrical smell. And I went on that flight deck expecting to hear that we had some electrical smoke somewhere on the aircraft. But nothing was further from the truth.
When did it start? Or just after you stepped out? Anything on radar?
No, it's clear, not a cloud. Oh my lord, look at engine 4! It's lit up somehow. Captain, have a look at number 1.
It's the same on my side.
None of the crew have ever seen anything like this before. But the light show is just the beginning. Their bizarre flight is about to take a terrifying turn for the worse. Strange lights are striking the windshield of a British Airways passenger jet heading to Perth, Australia. At the same time, the plane's engines are lit by a brilliant white glow.
Look at engine 4! It's lit up somehow.
This light show, if you like, had become more intense. In fact, we ended up sitting there with 2 sheets of brilliant white light in front of us in place of the windscreens.
Inside the cabin, smoke has been growing thicker. Chief Steward Graham Skinner has been organizing an intense but quiet search for fire.
What's with all the smoke?
There was smoke in the cabin. It got really, really hot. You were perspiring, literally drenched in perspiration. The acrid smoke was at the back of your throat, up your nose, in your eyes, and you were rubbing this and your eyes were running, and it was, it's not a very nice situation at all.
Flight engineer Barry Townley Freeman has been checking his instruments carefully. He's smelled the smoke, but so far has no indication that there's a fire in any of the plane's systems.
Can't find anything.
With one mystery confronting them, they're suddenly faced with a frightening new situation.
Dad! The engine's on fire!
The whole of the wing was a sheet of light. And I thought, wow. I said, oh, you better close that because we don't know what's that.
Cheers. Sit down.
Where are they going?
Stephen, close the blind.
Then I realised that, you know, something was dramatically wrong.
There were huge flames coming out of the back of the engines, 20, some people said 40 feet long. These huge jets of sheer flame shooting out of the back of all the engines. Is it going to penetrate from the outside of the aircraft? Is it going to come into the cabin? Are we going to burn to death? Are we going to choke to death on the smoke? What's going to happen? What's causing it? What are they going to do about it?
As fire engulfs the engines, one of them revs loudly and flames out.
Engine failure. Number 4. Fire action. Number 4.
Checklist powering gear.
Set.
Thrust lever.
Closed.
Start lever.
Off.
Once one engine fails, you call for the drill to shut that one down. You have drills for certain things so that you don't fly together as a crew forever. You can fly with different people then, and you can standardize the operations.
The instruments do not indicate a fire on the plane, but the passengers can see flames erupting from the engines and stretching down the length of the 747.
I could not see the engines from where I was sitting. I could only see the space behind them. But there was enough glow in that space to convince me that the aircraft was really seriously on fire.
We were in trouble. They knew, as long as they were, they knew we were in bad trouble. And they sort of just looked at me as if to say, well, what are we doing now, Dad?
If anything's going to happen, I want to be close to you. Oh, please.
The cabin crew begins storing anything that's loose. They don't want dishes or bottles flying around the cabin if the plane begins to dive.
Don't worry. Just friction.
If I was misleading them, then that was for a reason, because I didn't want to get as upset as I felt. I just couldn't believe it. And, you know, this is going through my mind, and yet I'm chatting to the passengers and chatting to the crew, saying, oh, yeah, nothing to worry about. Yeah, it's just a little hiccup, you know.
The 747 is more than 10 kilometers above the ocean. Its engines appear to be burning, and peculiar smoke continues to fill the cabin. And then, the unthinkable happens.
Number 2 engine's gone. All right, then. Begin the engine shutdown.
No, wait!
We've all gone. All 4 engines have failed.
The other 3 just went out almost immediately, and that's when it begins to be a serious emergency.
Those engines made a grating, rumbling sound, almost like a cement mixer. And then, gradually, the noise just disappeared and they became silent.
A minute and a half, we've gone from 4 engines running normally to having none.
The 747 has plenty of fuel, yet somehow all 4 of the jet's engines have completely stopped working.
Roger, declare emergency.
Mayday, 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 Speedbird 9. We have lost all 4 engines out of 370. Mayday, 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 Speedbird 9. We have lost all 4 engines.
With no engine power and no idea what has crippled their plane, British Airways Flight 9 begins falling from the sky.
Jakarta Control, Speedbird 9. We have lost all 4 engines, now out of 360.
First Officer Roger Greaves issues a mayday, but he has trouble getting his message across.
Jakarta Control, Speedbird 9. We have lost all 4 engines. Repeat, all 4 engines. Now descending through flight level 350.
Speedbird 9, you have lost number 4 engine?
This idiot doesn't understand. Jakarta Control, Speedbird 9, we have lost all 4 engines. Repeat, all 4 engines. Now descending through flight level 350.
The air traffic control at Jakarta, unfortunately, seemed to have a slight problem in understanding what we actually were saying.
Only when another plane nearby relays the Mayday call do controllers in Jakarta understand.
Now descending through flight level 350.
Speedbird 9, all 4 engines out. Understood?
As far as the crew knows, no 747 had ever lost power to all of its engines before. The crew has to find out why it's happening now.
I think we've cocked something up.
We were concerned and worried that we'd done something wrong, you know, to cause the whole thing.
All 3 of us felt exactly the same, and it was a personal guilt in the sense of, what have I missed? What have I done wrong? You know, because, you know, this kind of thing doesn't happen.
While not built for gliding, even without its engines, a 747 can travel forward 15 kilometers for every kilometer it drops. With no power, Flight 9 has started a long, slow fall. Some 10 kilometers above the ocean, the crew has less than half an hour before they smash into the sea.
When they all stop, you go into automatic mode, obviously. We had practiced this drill on the simulator many, many times. And that's very good and all very well, as long as when it happens to you for real, what happens on the aeroplane is mirrored by what happens to you in the simulator. And I'm afraid that wasn't so.
In the simulator, when all 4 engines stop, the autopilot turns off. But high above the Indian Ocean, Captain Moody sees that his autopilot is still on.
We were all 3 confused and concerned that what was happening to us wasn't what we'd been told would happen to us.
All right, begin restart drill.
In the heat of the situation, they have no time to figure out why the autopilot is still on.
On. Anything? Anything?
No.
Again. All right then, from the top, battery. Check. On. Crossfeed valves. Open. Fire switch. In.
The standard restart drill takes up to 3 minutes to complete. Plunging from the sky, the crew has fewer than 10 chances to get their engines going before they run out of time.
Lever on. Come on.
Again, gentlemen.
All right, from the top, battery. Check. On. Crossfeed valves. Open. Fire switch. In.
At 10,000 meters, Captain Eric Moody decides to turn the plane back toward the closest airport, Halim, just outside Jakarta. But even that is too far away if he can't get at least some of the engines going again.
Jakarta, Speedbird 9, turning left back to Halim, out of 300.
Speedbird 9, radar cannot see you. Squawk Alpha 7700.
Air traffic control asks them to transmit the emergency transponder signal.
Jakarta, Speedbird 9. We are already squawking 7700.
Now the crew is flying back to an airport that can't find them on radar. Without the constant rumble of the engines, the cabin is quiet. Some of the passengers feel the plane beginning to descend. But without communication from the cockpit, they can only guess.
The quietness was unbelievable, because it was sort of, the aeroplane was no engines, nothing, and it seemed to be eerie, you know, a bit surreal really, because like as if you was suspended in space or something, and all you could feel was this quietness and the whimpering from a few people that were really upset.
Some people were sitting quite rigidly, almost as if they hadn't noticed anything. At first it was sheer fear, and then after a while it turns to acceptance. You know you're going to die. We knew we were going to die.
What's going on? What's the problem?
It's just a technical fault. I've been through much worse, let me tell you. Everything will be fine.
I think if I'd have sat down and really thought of exactly what was happening, I don't think I would have ever got up again.
One steward came up to us and said, "Are you two ladies all right?" And Yes, we said we're fine, which was an absolute lie, but that's how it was. It seemed absolutely vital not to panic.
Captain Moody can't restart the engines unless he can keep the plane flying between 250 and 270 knots. But the airspeed indicators aren't working.
Captain, I've got 320 knots on my side.
Well, I've got 270.
Well, bloody hell, that's a 50-knot difference.
I'll change the speed.
Falling from the sky with no engine power, the crew now have no idea how fast they're going. But to have the best chance to restart the engines, Captain Moody has to have the plane flying at the right speed.
So from that point onwards, Eric then varied the speed through just about 100-knot range, hoping that at some point or other, coincidental with us putting the fuel into the engines, that we would actually be at the right speed.
To change speeds, Captain Moody turns the autopilot off. Then he slowly pulls the nose of the jet up to slow it, and then pushes it down to increase his speed. The upsetting roller coaster movement adds to the panic felt in the cabin.
At one time, the aircraft developed a strange motion. It seemed to be climbing steeply and then diving down. That was the sensation we got. And a bucking action that was so violent that we felt it could break the aircraft up in the air.
Pressure warning, Captain. We're at 10,000. Pressure warning? That's not supposed to do that.
And a warning horn went off. Now, this didn't ever happen on the simulator in this exercise, so it was a bit of a surprise to us.
As well as providing electrical power, the engines on a jumbo jet help keep the cabin pressurized.
With the engines not working, of course, the air wasn't being pumped in. So gradually, the pressure was leaking away.
With all 4 engines gone, the pressurized air is rapidly seeping out. The thinning level of oxygen makes passengers gasp. The crew reach for their oxygen masks. But First Officer Greaves can't get his mask to work.
My oxygen mask, yeah, that was a problem I could have done without. It was stowed above my head. And when I pulled the oxygen mask down, the mask and the tube became separated.
The captain must make a difficult choice. If he continues to descend slowly, it will get increasingly difficult for First Officer Greaves to breathe.
I said, look, if we get down to 20,000 feet quickly, we can all take our oxygen masks off and we can talk and we're back as a crew again.
We had to actually increase the rate of descent to descend to a lower altitude quicker, which in the circumstances was something that we wouldn't really have chosen to do.
So then I dived the aeroplane and got rid of about 6,000 feet in a minute.
The loss of cabin pressure and the steep dive have another terrifying consequence.
The things shot down, they sort of dangled down in front of you. And I looked to see Stephen had got his and Chaz had pulled his out of the socket. So I made sure that Chaz got his oxygen. I've seen a few movies on planes, and you know, once that happens, you know you're in serious trouble.
Calmly. Here we go. Breathe normally, Mum, not deep. Breathe calmly.
The oxygen masks came down, and we put those to our faces as had been described in the drill, which fortunately we had been observing at the beginning of the flight. But it seemed that the oxygen supply was not working.
I'm not getting.
The cabin crew try to use the public address system to explain what's going on, but it's not working. Chief Steward Graham Skinner makes do with a low-tech backup.
Can you hear me? We're having a small problem with the public address system. So if you would, place your masks over your mouth and nose and breathe normally.
As the passengers struggle with their masks, Captain Eric Moody is running out of options. If his engines don't start soon, he'll have to turn his jet around and try landing on the open ocean. High above the Indian Ocean, the seemingly impossible has occurred. All 4 engines on a British Airways 747 have stopped working, and the crew has no idea why. First Officer Roger Greaves manages to fix his broken oxygen mask, but he's still frustrated by engines that won't start.
All right, Barry, let's start the restart drill. Ready? Set. Battery. Check. On. Standby power. On. Anything? Come on, anything. No. All right, then, let's do it from the top. Battery. Check. On.
First Officer Greaves and engineer Barry Townley Freeman have actually shortened the standard restart drill. It's giving them more chances to get the engines going, but so far nothing's working.
Come on, you old sod.
The process that we were going through the whole time was just continuous. We hadn't had any success with the drill at all, despite all the efforts we were putting in. But it was the only thing we had left to cling on to, so that's what we did.
From the top again. Battery. Check. On.
I have no idea, and I don't think any of us have, how many times we tried to restart those engines. If I say 20, I would think that's too low. If I say 50, I would think that's probably about right.
As the plane falls lower and lower, Captain Moody faces a brutal choice. A mountain range cuts across the island of Java between his plane and the airport. He knows he has to be at least 3,500 meters high to clear it. But if his engines don't restart soon, they won't make it. At this rate, it will crash in a matter of minutes. It's just a question of where. Captain Moody decides if the engines don't restart soon, he'll turn back towards the ocean and try landing on the water.
All right, are we getting something?
It's not starting.
I knew it was so difficult to land aeroplanes on the sea, even when you had everything going for you. And I thought that, well, we haven't got much going for us here. I'd never done it before.
Hiding his concern, Captain Moody addresses the passengers and crew.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a small problem. All 4 engines have stopped. We're doing our damnedest to get it under control. I trust you are not in too much distress.
Most of the passengers expect the worst.
Ma, in trouble. Plane going down.
We'll do best for the boys. We love you. Sorry, Pa. I thought we were going down, heading for the ocean, which crash. And I thought if she got the note, you know, she knew we were still thinking about it. And we did whatever we could.
Will we be burnt alive? Will we be choked by the smoke? Will the aircraft break up in the air and hurtle us out into space, which was my biggest fear? Or will we come down in the sea and be eaten by sharks alive? Or will we crash into a mountain? Let's crash into a mountain quickly and get all this over.
Well?
Nothing. It's not starting.
All right, from the top then. Battery. Check.
On.
Standby power.
On.
Finally, Captain Moody has to decide. Carry on and likely crash into the mountains, or turn around and ditch into the sea.
I don't know how to swim.
I couldn't swim anyway, so I thought, well, you know, I'm doomed anyway. And I just hoped that maybe one of the passengers might help the 2 boys to make sure that they could stay afloat.
Well, anything? No. All right then, from the top again. Battery.
We had very few chances left of starting the engines before having to turn out to to sea again because we wouldn't have been able to clear the mountains on the south coast of Java.
Start level. Cut off.
Fuel pressure.
Available.
Standby ignition on.
And then, as suddenly as it had stopped working, the fourth engine roars back to life.
Engine 4, back online.
Then all of a sudden there was this sort of like somebody giving the aeroplane a punch from underneath. And then I realised that it might have been an engine. It was a boom.
Oh my God, no.
The noise that a Rolls-Royce engine makes when it starts up is low rumbling noise, you know, and it was just, well, it was wonderful to hear it.
A 747 can fly with one engine, but Captain Moody knows that just one engine still won't give him enough power to clear the mountains.
The glass now is half full, it's not half empty. We're now in with a real chance, and I tell you what, the three of us would have dragged that aeroplane around the whole island of Java.
As the plane falls past 4,000 meters, another engine coughs and comes back to life.
Engine 3, back online.
It's followed quickly by the final two.
I don't believe it. Engines 1 and 2, both back online.
From almost certain disaster, the crippled jet is now under full power.
Oh my God, Mark.
I realised then that we could make it back to, not to Perth, but to an airport. That's all we wanted, was to land on the earth and you know, be part of the living again. Because while we were up there, we were dead.
Jakarta, Speedbird 9, we are back in business. All four running, all four
This
running.
time, local controllers have no trouble understanding the message.
All four engines serviceable again. Confirm continuing to Hali.
Affirmative, affirmative.
We say, right, let's get this thing on the ground as quickly as we can.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We seem to have overcome that problem and have managed to start all the engines. We are diverting to Jakarta and expect to land in about 15 minutes.
Captain Moody begins climbing, putting plenty of room between his plane and the mountains below. But as he does, the strange lights that he saw when the crisis began reappear in front of the jet.
Now, as soon as we got to 15,000 feet, this St Elmo's fire started again. Now, I'm not slow, so I said, let's get out of here quickly.
But before he can descend very far, the plane is stricken again.
Engine 2 is surging.
The whole aeroplane was shaking. It was just going bang, bang, bang.
The atmosphere in the cabin was very tense and very quiet. By then, I think very few people were talking. I think there were quite a lot of prayers going up.
The engines backfire violently. The captain must make another fateful decision.
Begin shutdown drill.
Checklist, powering gear.
Off.
Thrust lever.
Closed.
We were reluctant to do it, as you can probably understand, but, you know, that was it. So we were back on 3 engines.
Now, I'm not a coward, but when you've had 4 engines going, no engines going, you get 4 going and show me any pilot that will quickly shut down that engine, because you're worried that they're all going to stop again.
Jakarta, Speedbird 9, leaving 154, 120. We are now on 3 engines.
As the plane closes in on the airport, First Officer Greaves thinks the windshield is covered in moisture, making it hard to see through.
And I said to Eric, yeah, it's a bit misty out there. So we turned the blowers on to kind of, you know, like demisters on your car to try and clear that. That didn't work. I used the windscreen wipers, and that didn't work.
Somehow the glass itself has been badly damaged.
For some unknown reason, I looked out the edge of my windscreen, and about a 2-inch strip down the edge on the left-hand side, I could see much more clearly. But I couldn't see anything much out the front. It was getting more and more opaque the nearer and nearer we got to the lights.
The crew get a final unwelcome surprise. Equipment on the ground that helps them descend at the proper angle isn't working.
Jakarta ATC. Be advised, our glide path is unserviceable.
The localizer, which gives you the left and right of the runway centerline, that was working, but the glide slope, which gives you the actual profile for the descent, was not working.
After all the troubles they've been through, now the crew has to land their plane manually.
We then continued with Eric flying the localizer and me calling out the distance and the altitude that he should be at.
300 feet, Captain.
So he was then able to adjust his rate of descent to what I was telling him as far as the glide slope was concerned.
200. 150 feet, Captain. 100. 50 feet. 30 feet.
Oh my God. Oh my God. We're on the runway.
Reverse.
$90 knots, 80 knots.
We're down. Could really go for a cold soda.
And the aeroplane just landed itself. It seemed to anyway. It kissed the earth. It was beautiful.
That's amazing.
Safely on the ground at Halim Airport in Jakarta, passengers celebrate the end of a harrowing ordeal. They also want to know what happened. No fire had been found, so why had smoke filled the cabin? How could all 4 engines have stopped at nearly the same time? What were the strange lights that surrounded the plane? In the cockpit, the flight crew are relieved, but also concerned that they might be at fault.
The first thing that we did, having parked the airplane and shut it all down, was to then go through all the paperwork to see if there was possibly anything anywhere in it that might have given us any pre-warning of some sort of phenomenon that caused what happened to us.
Every time, because it's going to come back to us.
The damage to the 747 is extensive. From the outside, the crew realize that their windshield had been deeply scratched. They see bare metal showing through where the paint has somehow been stripped away. And they still have no idea why any of it happened. When investigators uncover the cause of the disaster, Flight 9 changes pilot training around the world. During a calm flight to Australia, all 4 engines of a British Airways 747 suddenly stopped working. After a long, terrifying descent, the crew managed to restart the engines and land.
Wow, that's amazing.
They spent an excited and largely sleepless night in Jakarta before returning to Halim Airport to inspect their plane.
And we went back the next day to look at it in daylight. The aeroplane had lost its sheen, and in some places it had been sandblasted quite well, and all the decals and the paint had come off. It really was very little to see until they stripped the engines down.
The engines were manufactured by Rolls-Royce. Their investigation was led by a former engineer, Malcolm Grayburn.
3 of the engines were removed in Jakarta. following the incident and were ferried back via cargo aircraft to London Heathrow and then transported to South Wales, where the engines were, in fact, stripped down into piece parts. And it was there that I got involved.
Greyburn was stunned by what he saw. Much of the engine was badly scratched and scored.
We did do a forensic analysis of the engines, and we did record it all in terms of photographic analysis, and also we did a lot of laboratory analysis.
Greyburn discovered the engines were choked with fine dust, pieces of rock and sand. When it was closely studied, they learned that the debris was clearly volcanic ash. Days after their harrowing flight, the passengers and crew learned that the night they were flying, there'd been a major eruption of the Mount Galunggung volcano, located just 160 kilometers southeast of Jakarta. Tom Casadevall is director of the US Geological Survey and has studied the Galunggung volcano.
Indonesia is the world's most volcanically active country. It has more than 130 historically active volcanoes, meaning volcanoes which have erupted in the last several thousand years. Galunggung erupted explosively early in the 1980s. In April, May, June of 1982, the eruptions became increasingly more powerful.
The eruptions were large and the damage was extensive. More than 60,000 people were evacuated from the area around the mountain. The night Flight 9 flew nearby, the volcano erupted again. As the ash cloud rose more than 15,000 meters into the night, winds pushed it to the southwest, right into the path of British Airways Flight 9. Never before had a volcanic cloud seriously affected an airplane. Could the ash really have crippled this flight?
Roger, declare emergency.
Mayday, 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 Speedbird 9. We have lost all 4 engines.
Unlike ash that you might see in a chimney or after a fire in a forest, this is not soft material at all. This is very fine, ground-up particles of solid rock and minerals. This material is very, very abrasive. It's very angular in shape. If you were to see it under a microscope, you would see very sharp angles. And so that's what caused the abrasion.
In addition to sandblasting the windshield and all the leading edges of the plane, could the ash cloud explain all the other strange phenomena the passengers and crew had experienced?
Remember, the aircraft is moving in close to 500 miles per hour as it's flying into that cloud. Even though it's a very fine material, it can still cause abrasion and friction on the skin of the aircraft. Because it's such a dry environment up there, that frictional electrification produces the glow that we refer to as St. Elmo's fire.
The electrification also caused the interference in communication experienced by the crew.
Speedbird 9, you have lost number 4 engine?
Some of the volcanic ash that was sucked in and ground up by the engines was also blown into the plane. And when passengers and crew saw it swirling through the cabin, they feared the worst.
You're a passenger, you're looking out the window, suddenly you start breathing this sulfur-laden air in the cabin, and it probably is a choking, probably a shocking sensation. It's essentially a house of horrors type situation.
While the volcanic ash caused the visible scarring, filled the plane with smoke and fouled communications, could it cause the engines to flame out as well?
An X-ray from front to back of the engine.
A turbofan jet engine works by sucking in enormous amounts of air. The air is then highly pressurized by the engine's compressor. This tightly packed air is mixed with fuel and ignited. The force of this reaction propels the jet through the sky.
The temperature in the combustion chamber where this ash was flowing through are around 2,000 degrees centigrade. And so The volcanic ash, we know, melts at about 1,300, 1,400 degrees.
But when the liquid ash reached deeper into the engine, it cooled slightly, turning into a sticky, molten goo. It attached itself to the engine and began choking it.
We got a fundamental disturbance of the airflow in the main core of the engine, which caused the engine to backfire, and the engines flamed out, and that was the cause of the problem.
Backfires occur when the engine isn't burning cleanly.
The engine's on fire!
There's too much fuel and not enough oxygen.
Engine failure, number 4.
Fire action, number 4.
Checklist powering gear.
On Flight 9, the backfires were the cause of the enormous jets of flame many passengers saw behind the engines. After struggling against the choking effects of the ash cloud, the engines on board the 747 flamed out. What Grayburn found next was that a remarkable piece of chemistry saved the plane.
As soon as you came out of the volcanic ash, and the engines were not running, remember, so everything cooled down, it was enough for this stuff to break off and allow the engines to restart.
When enough of the molten ash was gone, the engines were clear again, and Townley Freeman's frantic efforts to restart them paid off.
Engine 4, back online.
We have learned quite a bit, and we've incorporated this learning into pilot training. Pilots now, for example, know what signs to look for when they might be in an ash cloud, and those signs include the odor of sulfur in the cabin, dust accumulating in the cabin, and if you're at night, you might look out and see the frictional electrification or the St. Elmo's fire on the leading edges of the aircraft.
Another important lesson learned from Flight 9 is that volcanic ash clouds do not appear on normal weather radar, which reflects water. Since the clouds are dry, they're all but invisible to radar. That knowledge has led to better communications between the geologists that study volcanoes and the international airlines that fly over them. The crew of Flight 9 was showered with awards and commendations in the months after their incredible night.
I thought the airmanship displayed by this crew during this event was absolutely fantastic. The way that they managed to guide this aircraft back down to a safe landing after having been through such extreme circumstances, it was fantastic the way they recovered this aircraft. Absolutely brilliant.
For everyone on board Flight 9, the terrifying plunge through the skies had a lasting impact. Betty Tootell was so struck by the events of that night that she wrote a book about the ordeal.
This was an event which was unique in aviation history, and it seemed to me absolutely vital that it should be put on record, and I wondered who was going to do this. But no sooner had that thought entered my mind than I thought, I'm going to do that.
Tootell would also end up marrying a man she met on the flight, James Ferguson. Charles Capewell and his 2 sons made it home 2 days after they touched down in Jakarta. 25 years later, both Chaz and Stephen still live in Perth.
Our time hadn't came and that was it. From then on, I took a different view of life. When your time comes, there's nothing you can do, but you can still hope. And we hoped, and we got out of it.
Not long after their fateful flight, Captain Eric Moody created the Galungung Gliding Club. Every member of the crew and all passengers were automatically admitted to this exclusive group. The survivors of British Airways Flight 9 happily stay in touch to this day. Smoke fills a passenger plane 10 kilometers in the sky.
We're on Mayday. We're going down.
Electrical systems shut down as the smoke spreads. The crew tries desperately to land their stricken plane.
We're going to need an emergency landing. Put your head on your lap.
We're going to need 5 trucks. They're standing by for you.
What seemed like a small problem at first has become a life or death struggle for everyone on board Air Canada Flight 797. Early evening, June the 2nd, 1983. Supper time aboard Air Canada Flight 797. Captain Donald Cameron has been working for Air Canada for 17 years and has flown almost 5,000 hours on a DC-9. But it doesn't mean he gets to eat first.
How's your seafood? Nice?
Before he can dig in, his first officer, Claude Ouimet, will have to finish.
Good.
The jet is in the middle of a flight from Dallas, Texas to Montreal with a stopover in Toronto. The heavy cloud cover below hides some light showers, but at their cruising altitude of 10,000 meters, the view is clear and bright. The DC-9 is only half full today, with 41 passengers scattered throughout the plane.
Can I have some tea, please?
24-year-old Diane Fadley is an active member of the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation.
We have a number of different fundraising activities, and once a year they have a large conference, and at this time it happened to be in Toronto.
Raymond Chalifaux is 23 and recently married. An engineer, he's returning home from his first ever business trip.
It was a little bit frightening both for me and for my wife. I was supposed to be gone 4 or 5 days, so first time we were separated for a long period of time, so it was kind of insecure for me, yeah.
And a few rows further up sits a growing legend in the world of folk music. Stan Rogers is just 33, but his career is beginning to take off outside of his native Canada.
I think Stan's best-known songs celebrate ordinary people. The songs are really about ordinary people rising to the occasion and becoming heroes on their own.
Just before 7 o'clock, the plane is a little more than halfway to Toronto.
What was that? It's right there, I see it. Right there.
Yeah.
3 circuit breakers have popped out. Like fuses, they protect delicate electrical circuits on the plane from becoming overloaded.
Like a machine gun.
Yeah. Zap, zap, zap.
The 3 breakers are for the flushing motor in the toilet at the rear of the plane. Cameron decides to give them a few minutes before he tries to reset them again.
You know, sometimes it overworks and overeats, and then the breaker popped, and then it cools off, and then you push the breaker and everything is fine. So put the snag in the logbook, and that's it.
Someone must have pushed a rag down the toilet or something. Jammed it and it overheated.
Cameron thinks that something must be stopping the motor from working properly. But it's not an emergency. Toilets get blocked all the time. Several minutes pass as the plane continues on its way to Toronto. Flight attendants Laura Kayama and Judy Davidson are busy serving up dinner in the cabin. In the cockpit, it's Captain Cameron's turn for dinner. But first, he wants to reset the 3 circuit breakers. Without them, the toilet won't work. The rest of the flight could get uncomfortable for the passengers.
Pop says I push it.
He's given it more than 8 minutes. But whatever is wrong with the washroom, it isn't fixing itself. In the cabin, one of the passengers complains about a disturbing odor.
Yeah, that is a strange smell. Let me take a look.
Connie Kirsch, a Texan headed for a business meeting in Toronto, is seated at the back of the plane.
I had smelled a peculiar smell where I was sitting. And I It struck me as odd. Actually, it was a wiry smell. It wasn't a smoke smell.
A wisp of smoke is leaking out of the washroom. The smoke and the acrid smell of burning plastic takes Davidson by surprise. This is much more than just a clogged toilet. Other passengers are beginning to notice the smoke and the suffocating smell.
Sergio, there's a problem in the washer. Judy says there's a fire.
Okay, I'll be right there.
Chief Flight Attendant Sergio Benetti is in charge of the cabin crew.
As a precaution, we're moving everyone to Free Rosa.
The smoke is noxious and overpowering. Benetti can't see any flames. He sprays the fire extinguisher into the tiny washroom, trying to coat every surface.
As soon as I saw that fire extinguisher, something went through my mind. There's definitely something wrong. The guy seemed to have the thing under control, so he's gonna do his job and things will be business as usual.
It's 2 minutes past 7, just 11 minutes since the circuit breakers first popped out. Laura Kayama brings Captain Cameron the disturbing news.
Excuse me, Captain. There's a fire in the washroom in the back. They just went back to go put it out.
You want me to go back?
Yeah, go.
A fire on board an aircraft is one of the worst situations any crew can face. The plane is some 10 kilometers high. What starts as a spark can turn deadly in a few short minutes. But at the moment, Cameron doesn't know how bad the situation is.
You got to remember, in 1983, people were allowed to smoke in the aircraft. And there had been a number of incidents of this sort of in the industry. So it really didn't alarm me that much.
Ouimet finds the situation is worse than he expected.
I didn't see any flames when I opened the door before, but I sprayed it really good with the fire extinguisher.
You think it was a cigarette in the garbage?
No, not really.
Okay. Can't get back there. Smoke's too heavy. I think we'd better go down.
But Flight Attendant Sergio Benetti has a very different assessment of the situation.
You don't have to worry. I think the smoke's easing up.
It's a confusing moment for Captain Cameron.
Some components do fail from time to time that are not severe or serious enough to cause an emergency descent. That's a pretty serious thing.
When Ouimet and Benetti were at the back of the plane, the smoke seemed thick, but now it appears to be subsiding.
Okay, it's starting to clear now. But I'll go back and check if that's okay.
Yeah, that's okay. Take these goggles. I'll leave my mask on. Go back wherever you can, but don't get yourself incapacitated.
No problem. No problem.
If it's just a broken toilet motor, Cameron can still make it to Toronto. But if it's more serious, he'll have to land immediately before the small inconvenience becomes a deadly problem. June the 2nd, 1983. Air Canada Flight 797 cruises through the early evening. The flight has taken an unsettling turn. Wisps of smoke are gathering at the back of the DC-9. An acrid smell is spreading through the cabin. The crew is growing concerned. They've already moved passengers towards the front of the jet, as far as possible from the creeping smoke. Captain Donald Cameron is waiting for an update from the back of the plane, when suddenly he's got a new problem. The master warning light is on. Electrical systems throughout the plane, including some in the cockpit, begin to fail.
The airplane basically lost all its sophisticated navigation and attitude information. So I was left very suddenly with, I think, 3 engine instruments per engine and 4 flight instruments, which were very primitive. They were what you might have flown a World War II bomber with.
With his electrical systems starting to shut down, Cameron calls the nearest ground control.
Memphis Center, this is Air Canada 797.
Air Canada 797, Indianapolis Center. Go ahead.
Yeah, we've got an electrical problem here. We may be off communication shortly. Stand by.
Co-pilot Claude Ouimet is at the back of the plane. The washroom door handle has become hot to the touch. He doesn't even risk opening it. Faced with a potential fire on board, the crew have no choice but to land their plane as soon as possible.
I don't like what's happening. I think we'd better go down. We're going to be making an emergency descent. Brief the cabin crew. Yes, sir.
As soon as the decision is made, another warning light goes on. They've just lost most of their emergency power.
We're talking about multiple failure here, and it's starting to be complicated. So we're going down, and obviously we have to land.
Mayday, mayday, mayday.
A small problem has snowballed into an all-out emergency.
Mayday, mayday, mayday.
This is Louisville Control, over.
Air Canada 797, we have a fire on board. We are going down.
Can you possibly make Cincinnati?
Roger that.
Cincinnati is 46 kilometers away. They can make it. Captain Cameron begins an initial descent to 1,500 meters. The crew has switched to emergency battery power, but many of the plane's instruments aren't functioning.
So all we had left was DC immer power, and that's only good for radios, basically.
It's not only instruments. Cameron finds that a critical piece of his plane isn't working properly. The horizontal stabilizer on the tail of his DC-9 is frozen. Cameron uses the part that's still working, the elevators, to make the plane dive. But like a car that's lost power steering, the aircraft resists. As Cameron pushes on the controls, they push back with a pressure equal to 20 kilograms.
The airplane became very heavy, and I took my total concentration to fly the airplane.
An acrid, bitter smoke is creeping forward from the back of the plane and seeping in from the seams in the fuselage ceiling. It hovers like a cloud over the passengers' heads.
Incredibly harsh smoke that was really irritating your throat. You had to take really, really small breath, otherwise you would choke.
I could see it rise. It was traveling along those luggage racks, you know, coming forward.
The smell of burning plastic fills the air. Dropping oxygen masks could make the situation worse.
I could have deployed the oxygen mask for the passengers, but it's forbidden. You're only allowed to use the oxygen mask in a case of a massive decompression or loss of cabin pressure, not for fire.
I was crying and scared. I wasn't hysterical. The gentleman sitting next to me explained to me that if I would not cry and if I could, you know, conserve my not breathe so fast, that it would conserve the oxygen, would help us, and not to worry, that the flight attendants, they really know how to handle these sort of situations.
As the electrical malfunctions ripple through the plane, the PA system shuts down. Flight attendants struggle to shout directions, but it's getting more and more difficult to breathe. In 1983, it's not standard procedure to tell passengers how to open the emergency doors. But in this case, the two flight attendants are taking no chances.
Plain as possible.
As smoke begins entering the cockpit, the captain's situation is becoming critical. For the first time, Ouimet talks to the Cincinnati airport.
Approach, Air Canada 797. we're on Mayday. We're going down.
Air Canada 797, Cincinnati approach. Plan runway 36 ILS. And the equipment has been alerted. Do you have time to give me the nature of the emergency?
We have a fire in the washroom. We're filling up with smoke right now.
Say, type of aircraft, number of people on board, and amount of fuel.
We'll copy that later. We don't have time.
Gregory Karam is the approach tower controller. He's the lifeline for the struggling jet. He can't see the plane on radar yet, but he knows it's in trouble.
There was really no mayhem whatsoever, no screaming, nothing at all. In fact, it was very quiet and calm. And again, I was terrified at that point.
Almost 13 minutes after 7, Karam catches sight of Flight 797 on his radar.
Air Canada 797, you are now fully identified. This will be a no-gyro radar approach for runway 27 left. Descend now to 3,500 feet. Your position is now 12 miles southeast of the airport.
The crew needs to be guided in from the ground. Struggling to see through the dense smoke, they could easily veer off course. Karam will talk them down, watching them every step of the way. In the cabin, the smoke and heat are becoming unbearable.
My thought was, well, we're gonna crash. They won't be able to identify myself because I didn't have my papers with me, so I stood up, I took my wallet in the compartment and put my jacket on so that they could identify my body.
I knew at that point, that's when I decided or felt that I was not going to make it because I felt I would never see my family again, and the situation just seemed very impossible.
Stan, he certainly had a sense of his own mortality, and he hated to fly. But the demand for Stan was growing, so he was flying more often. And he certainly had a sense that with so much traveling, his risk is elevated.
Where's the airport?
12 o'clock and 8 miles, Air Canada.
Okay, we're trying to locate it. We're going to need fire trucks.
They're standing by for you. Can you give me the number of people and amount of fuel?
We don't have time. Getting worse in here.
Understood, sir. Turn left now. You are 1/2 mile north of final approach.
Finally, the crew see the airport.
Okay, we have the airport.
The tower has you in sight. You need not acknowledge further transmission from the Air Canada 797. You are cleared to land. You are 4 miles from the airport. Good luck.
In a thick haze of smoke and soot, flight attendants Laura Kayama and Judy Davidson feel their way along the aisle, trying to reassure the passengers. They can't get past the 12th row. The smoke and the heat are overwhelming.
I was praying the whole time. Dear God, please help us land this plane. Please get this plane safely on the ground. Can't see, can't breathe, deaf, absolutely crossed my mind. But hang in there, don't give up.
I've been married for less than a year, and it's already over. So I started breathing as little as I could and start thinking seriously at my wife.
Fighting the reluctant controls, Captain Cameron's strength is being pushed to the limit.
"797, the tower has you in sight."
Squinting through the smoke, the crew of Flight 797 land hard. At 20 minutes after 7, the Air Canada plane is on the ground. It's less than 30 minutes since the first sign of any trouble on board Flight 797.
When we touch the ground, I assume that we're safe now. Now let's get out of this airplane.
But inside the plane, the smoke isn't letting up. Passengers are undoing their seatbelts and trying desperately to escape.
I got up out of my seat, and I remember putting my hands up on someone's back, and it was like waiting in a line. And I knew that was one line. I didn't want to wait very long. So I turned around and went the other direction, not knowing I was actually heading towards the front of the plane.
Sergio Bonetti is the first one to the door. He helps gasping passengers escape. The cabin is pitch black and burning hot. In the cockpit, the crew quickly shuts the plane down. The first officer escapes through the emergency window. It's a 5-meter jump to the ground. Passengers have opened 3 of the overwing exits. But even with the doors open, the exits are all but invisible. The smoke is too thick.
I saw a light, and it was the door that had opened. Someone had opened the door. I realized what it was. I ran to the door and held my head. I just put my face out so I could breathe.
Passengers who have found the exits slide off the wing and stumble to safety. On the ground, Laura Kayama and Judy Davidson frantically move passengers away from the deadly plane. Fire rescue vehicles surround the plane. They douse the plane's exterior and the ground beneath with foam, fearing a fuel fire or worse, an explosion. Through the cockpit window, we can see Captain Cameron sitting in his seat looking dazed and slumped towards the wheel.
First thing that got my attention was to see Don's face in the window and realize that he was not completely conscious.
I couldn't get out of my seat. I'd start and I'd get my arse up in the air or like that, and I'd be pushed back by I have no idea. It was an invisible force, but it was probably smoke and fire.
Desperately trying to save the captain's life, Wimet tells firefighters to cover him with foam.
It was this soapy, ice-cold mixture that drenched me.
It works. Cameron stirs and climbs out through the cockpit window.
Stop! There he is! Don!
Barely 90 seconds have passed since the plane landed, when suddenly the whole interior of Flight 797 ignites. The flames roll through the cabin like a train. Captain Donald Cameron is the last person to get out of the plane alive.
We knew there were people in the airplane, unfortunately, at that point. That was finished.
The cabin fire breaks through the top of the fuselage. Black smoke can be seen for kilometers. Flight attendant Laura Kayama begins to count.
I will remember these words forever. She told us to line up so that she could count the survivors. If there were survivors, obviously they were dead.
Including the crew, there had been 46 people aboard the plane. But there aren't 46 people on the runway.
I really thought that if the pilot could land the plane, we would all get off. But I knew when I looked around, I didn't think we were all there.
The passengers who escaped the plane suffer from smoke inhalation and minor injuries, but most are not badly hurt.
It was almost like if you got off the plane, nothing was wrong. I mean, there was maybe a sprained ankle, maybe someone had a broken arm or something. You made it and you were completely fine, or you didn't make it.
The young man next to me that helped me with my breathing techniques didn't survive. That was a real tough blow, because I know, for one, I believe he played a big part in my survival.
I guess it was around midnight. I decided to call Air Canada. I said, I'm trying to find out if a friend of mine was on this flight in Cincinnati. And she said, are you a member of the family? I said, no, I'm just a close friend. And she said, do you know if his wife is alone? And I said, well, yes. And she said, well, she may need somebody with her.
Stan Rogers, the rising musical star, didn't make it off the plane.
Cincinnati ground. This is Captain of the Air Canada flight that's on fire here.
Captain Cameron radios Cincinnati ground control from an emergency vehicle near his plane. He has a sobering message.
It seems there are 23 people left on board the aircraft. Is there a scheduled carrier runs into here that could maybe give aid and shelter to our stranded passengers? It's pretty cold out here.
What began with a simple electrical problem has taken the lives of 23 people. What caused the deadly fire? What went so horribly wrong? The investigation will uncover the plane's troubling history. This DC-9 had another serious accident just a few years before. In June of 1983, a strange smell in the back of an Air Canada DC-9 quickly turned into an all-out emergency. For 15 minutes, passengers and crew struggled to deal with thick, toxic smoke as it rolled through the plane. Flight 797 made a remarkable landing, only to burst into flames 90 seconds later. "23 people didn't escape the plane. Now the burnt shell of the DC-9 sits on the runway at the Greater Cincinnati Airport. It's one of the most disturbing airplane disasters in years. Within the hour, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board are on the scene. The first grim task of the investigators is to recover the bodies of the dead. 21 Canadians and 2 Americans. Many are burned beyond recognition. Almost all of the victims are found in the front half of the plane, between the wings and the cockpit. Some are still strapped into their seats. Others are found in the aisles. And even though all the passengers had been moved up earlier in the flight, 2 bodies are found near the rear, beyond the wings.
Because of the dense smoke in the cabin, the passengers couldn't see well enough to find the exits. And 2 passengers went beyond the overwing exits and succumbed to the environment.
Investigators take blood samples from the bodies. They find deadly levels of certain chemicals that were produced as the plane burned.
When we did toxicological studies, we were able to determine that there were some significant high levels of cyanide and fluoride in the blood, as well as carbon monoxide.
It's not known if the toxic fumes killed the passengers. All that's certain is that they were unable to escape before the flames tore through.
When I went on board, I was just struck by the acrid smell. It was kind of eerie because there was a lot of fire damage. A lot of the fuselage was burned. You know, the interior of the cabin was burned down to the tops of the seats.
With the bodies removed, investigators begin digging through the wreckage to try and find the cause of the fire. Among them are members of the FBI.
They were investigating to determine whether terrorism might have been a factor, so they were on scene right away looking at the aircraft to make that determination.
The FBI examines pieces of the plane's floor, samples of water from the washroom, even a plastic vial found on the floor.
The FBI became involved very early because of the possibility of a crime taking place takes precedent over a accident. They were looking for anything that would have to do with an incendiary device or a small explosive device or anything that could be fused to start a fire. They determined that there was no evidence of any crime being committed. It was probably accidental ignition, and so they then left and NTSB took over the accident.
Having discounted the possibility that the fire was deliberately set, investigators consider the next obvious cause: a cigarette. When smoking on planes was still allowed, the most common source of fires in a washroom was the trash container. Investigators examine the trash container and find that the top is burned away, but the trash chute and the container behind and below the sink are intact. Inside the container are remnants of paper, scorched but not burned. The fire could not have started here. With the most obvious potential causes discounted, investigators begin to comb through the wreckage looking for what had started the fire. Studying the history of the plane, Hill uncovers some startling facts. In the year before the accident, 76 separate maintenance issues had been written up in the plane's logbook. All were dealt with, but still, it's an unusually high number of problems. The plane's troubled history didn't end there. 4 years earlier, the rear bulkhead had failed, causing an explosive decompression. The crew had to make an emergency landing.
It knocked out a lot of electrical cable and hydraulics and stuff like that, and the guy did a hell of a job bringing it back to Boston.
The plane was repaired and put back into service, but Hill focuses on the wires that had to be stitched together after the accident. A bad repair job could have been the cause of the fire.
There were wires that ran through there that had been cut, spliced back together.
Investigators study all the wire splices they can find on Flight 797 that weren't destroyed in the fire, but they find no evidence of arcing or short-circuiting. It's another dead end. Investigators turn their attention to the cockpit voice recorder and the popping circuit breakers.
What was that? It's right there, I see it.
Right there.
Yeah.
Like a machine gun. Yeah. Zap, zap, zap.
The circuit breakers trip as a precaution. When they begin to overheat, the circuit breakers turn off, cutting electrical current to the motor. It's a safety feature, so the motor won't cause a fire.
Pops as I push it.
Investigators need to know if the breakers were tripped by a fire that had already started, or was the motor itself the problem? The NTSB build a mock-up of the plane's washroom and force the flush motor to seize. They want to see if it could have started the fire. The seized motor reaches a temperature of 428 degrees Celsius. It's hot, but it's not hot enough to ignite parts of the washroom around the motor. As they listen to the cockpit voice recorder, investigators uncover a puzzling clue. 3 minutes before the circuit breakers popped, the recorder picked up another noise. It was the sound of electrical arcing, like static, repeated 8 times. The noises weren't audible to the crew. Hidden from view on any airplane is a river of wiring. Investigators focus on a cable coming from a generator below the washroom floor. Insulation had rubbed off 2 wires, making it possible for sparks to be produced, sparks that could start a fire.
There was evidence that there was some electrical arcing, but it could have occurred after the insulation had burned on those wires.
In spite of countless hours of investigation and numerous tests, in the end, the NTSB can't pinpoint the exact cause of the fire. There simply isn't enough evidence.
Just because of the vast amount of damage that was done in that concentrated area around the lavatory where the fire burnt for a long period of time and possibly destroyed any of the evidence of where the fire actually ignited.
Even if they'll never know the exact cause of the fire, investigators try to understand how it could cause so much damage. There had been heat and smoke, but no one had seen any flames until an explosion ripped through the jet.
When you have a fire that has incomplete combustion, when it has a lack of oxygen, they will produce combustible gases. Those gases then can collect, especially in the crown of an aircraft.
The fire had burned out of sight behind the washroom walls, and the smoke, hot gases and fumes intensified and spread inside the wall space from the washroom through to the cabin walls. Those spaces acted as a sort of chimney for the gases and smoke that the fire was creating. Although the fire remained concealed behind the walls and ceiling panels, the smoke and hot gases entered the cabin through every seam, gathering in the upper space in the cabin and pressing down on the passengers.
The inaccessible areas and the cabin area are all linked together through small cracks and crevices and small openings. The plane is one big pressure vessel with everything being the same, equilibrated to the same pressure. So smoke and gases in those areas would fairly quickly start to permeate into the passenger cabin.
When the doors were opened during the evacuation, an unlimited supply of oxygen was suddenly available to feed the fire. The more intense the heat, the more oxygen hungry a fire becomes. The gas is ignited with the force of an explosion.
Once you have a flashover, you produce heat, toxic gases, and you burn up all the oxygen in the cabin, and it becomes non-survivable.
The technical part of the investigation is complete. But there are still a lot of questions about how the crew responded to the fire.
The first officer says it's starting to clear now, and at that point I reckon that the fire was under control.
Could they have done more to prevent the tragedy on board Flight 797? In 1983, a washroom fire on an Air Canada DC-9 filled the plane's cabin with smoke. The crew struggled to land the plane, but a flash fire ripped through the jet moments after it came to a stop. 23 people were killed.
There was a fireman hollering at us. I think the quote was, "She could blow at any minute."
NTSB investigators are unable to definitively pinpoint the cause of the fire. But after reviewing all the information they have, they're ready to release their report. The report on the lethal fire aboard Air Canada Flight 797 is published a year after the accident. It's a landmark in aircraft safety, but it immediately makes for controversial headlines. The NTSB points out that the source of the smoke was never identified, either by the flight attendants or the first officer. The captain was never told, nor did he inquire as to the precise location and extent of the fire which had been reported to him.
And with that in mind, what type of fire did you believe that you had?
The bin fire.
Mayday, Mayday, Mayday.
And the report asks a hypothetical question.
Canada 797, we have a fire on board. We are going down.
Can you possibly make Cincinnati?
Roger that.
If he'd begun to descend sooner, could the captain have landed at Standiford Field Airport in Louisville, Kentucky? It was a few minutes closer. The report and the media attention it gets are devastating to Captain Cameron and his crew. Soon after the report is released, there's an outcry among pilots in the industry. They resent its implied criticism of Flight 797's crew and the suggestion that they could have begun their descent 5 minutes sooner. Several months later, the Airline Pilots Association submits a petition that defends Cameron and the crew. It makes an impact. The NTSB release a revised report, including the petition by the Airline Pilots Association. In the petition, First Officer we met writes an impassioned defense of landing the plane where and when they did. The issue wasn't only the distance to the nearest airport, but the required rate of descent. As it was, the plane barely made the descent to the greater Cincinnati airport. Still, the National Transportation Safety Board's revised summary doesn't pull all its punches, pointing a finger at Captain Cameron. The report states that the time taken to evaluate the nature of the fire and to decide to initiate an emergency descent contributed to the severity of the accident. 20 years later, the statement still stings.
I'm glad they were all, the people that got off. I'm very sorry that the people that didn't get off, because we spent a lot of time and effort getting them there. That really bothered me. All I know is that I did the best I could.
Along with the comments on the performance of the crew, the NTSB recommends a host of safety improvements. Perhaps if the flight had been full, someone would have noticed the smell of smoke sooner. But what the washroom of Flight 797 could have used was a smoke detector. They weren't standard throughout the industry, but after Flight 797, attitudes and regulations changed. Even though flight attendants did receive some training in dealing with fires aboard a plane, it didn't go far enough. But what was more obvious, the flight attendants weren't properly equipped to attack fires. Without full-face masks and oxygen, they couldn't be expected to fight fire while holding their breath. In the years after Flight 797, attendants received better equipment and training. The cabin crew had also made split-second decisions that helped save lives. Moving passengers further up the plane and handing out wet towels minimized the effects of the toxic smoke. Their decision to tell passengers to open the emergency exits over the wings was not standard procedure, but it let some passengers escape more quickly and was eventually adopted as a routine practice. Finally, it became obvious from the location of some of the bodies that passengers died because of precious seconds lost trying to find the exits in the pitch dark. What would have made a difference? Track lighting on the floors and bumps along the overhead bins that identified the rows with emergency exits. Features that would eventually become standard.
As a direct result of 797, a number of rules were changed, including a more stringent test for seats, a heat release and smoke requirement for cabin interior panels, requirement for smoke detectors in lavatories, and halon fire extinguishers in the cabin.
You're gonna make an emergency landing. Put your head on your lap. Stay in that position.
But the changes were too late for those who died on Flight 797, like the man sitting beside Connie Kirsch. Months after the crash, his wife tracked Connie down.
She said, I just understand my husband was the one that was next to you, and I just wanted to know how was he? What was his spirits? And I said, he was in great spirits. He's very nice. He let me sit next to him and explained to me how to breathe. That was really difficult, you know, and the guilt that I carried for a long time was difficult. But I'm past the guilt, but I guess when you go back to it and you think about it like this in detail, you're right back there.
Stan Rogers was another victim of Flight 797. He would never be able to fulfill the promise of his life and growing career.
I loved his generosity and his loyalty as a friend. As an artist, he was perhaps one of the best songwriters this country's ever produced, and it was really an incredible pleasure and honor to be working with him. He still gets lots and lots of airplay, and so his legend grows.
Sometime after the accident, 2 Air Canada employees show up at Diane Fatley's door in Dallas.
They brought my Bible. It's dark because it was burned and singed, but it's a paperback Bible, and it did not completely burn up. This is just a reminder to me that God was with me. And I believe He protected me, and you know, He was there with me.
Captain Cameron and his crew eventually received 6 separate awards for their heroic actions on Flight 797, including recognition from the Royal Canadian Air Force. But they're all still haunted by the nightmare.
You feel responsible, there's no question. You feel guilt, you're willing to give your license. You feel very, very small until you get all the facts together, and because it's a puzzle for you, you know, you're as much as a victim in this. You're not supposed to fly an airplane in that condition, you know, so you're as much as a victim as the passenger, and I think it becomes all of our problem, and we're all part of the solution.
It's just a shame we didn't get everybody off. It still bothers me.